Okay, we're back, and we're going to talk in this segment about rater training and research on rater training. So, let's start with rater error training. So, in this strategy, the goal is to teach raters how to avoid those errors that we were talking about in the last lecture. The intent is to teach them about biases and, the halo effect and those other kinds of things, the primacy effect and the recency effect and all those kinds of things to try and help them to safeguard their ratings. Usually very specific advice is given, like to avoid the primacy or recency effect, you would want to be taking notes throughout the year about the person that you're rating. Not try and reflect as much on your memory as instead reflecting on notes that you've written contemporaneously, and that way you'll have much more current information. Being aware of the tendency to favor people who are kind of like you, and although just warning them that there are these inherent biases. It doesn't necessarily improve their accuracy unless they implement the concrete advice, like taking notes in real time and things like that. Even when people are made aware of their tendencies towards these cognitive errors and these biases, it's like it doesn't strengthen them against making those errors or having those biases. It's almost like we kid ourselves that those things only affect other people, or that I'm not doing it right now as I'm doing it right now. Right? I'm making that error right this minute, and I can't even see it because these biases are so insidious. So if we're really going to reduce error, the best thing is for supervisors to be taking notes throughout the year, through the period of time that they're making the observation. And so if we can really incentivize raters to do that, we can really improve their accuracy and reduce the rates of errors. Just making them aware of the errors doesn't do it. Then there's frame of reference training. And in this kind of training, the goal is to really enhance the rater's observational and categorization skills. So through this kind of training, the goal is to set up a common frame of reference, sort of decide what would be, acceptable behavior versus unacceptable or exceptional. So figuring out as a group what we're all looking for. So I kind of got a little picture where, we've got 4 individuals and they're all going to put the pieces together. They're all going to work the same way, right? They're all going to be working towards the same basic assessments. When we all, as individual observers, have the same common frame of reference, it really improves the accuracy. It really can work. In a very much smaller version of this kind of rating, I took a frame of reference training when I was a judge for something called Destination Imagination. It's something for K through 12 kids to, there's different categories where they can do either something that's well planned out, like skit. There's impromptu challenges that they can do. There's all sorts of different kinds of challenges they can do. And I would agree to be a judge because both of my kids participated in it through our school, and they always wanted to have, at least somebody from our school judging. So even after my kids stopped doing it, I continued on as a judge because it was a really fun and exciting day for the kids to display all the things that they'd been working on for like 8 months of the school year. And one of the most important things I learned the first year I did it was how to get a common frame of reference. Because all of us came in really concerned about judging children. We all came in thinking, I don't know, how am I supposed to give one group of children a higher score than a different group of children? This is going to be horrible. And one of the first things they did was they sat us judges down and they said, okay, so all of us are going to start off looking at the same, exhibit, and we're all going to give it a 4 out of 7, right? So we're all going to give it the mid-range score. When the next one comes on the stage, it's going to be really obvious to you whether it's better or it's worse than the one that you just saw before. So rate it as a higher score or a lower score. And then just go like that. We're all going to start with the first one and we're all giving it a 4. And then from there, we individually decide whether this one's a higher score or lower score than that initial group. So we all started with the same frame of reference, and whereas we all came in really concerned that we would be the outlier, or we'd be the one who really tanks it for this, really everybody else thought it was the greatest and we didn't like it, or we just thought we'd be the weak link. It turned out that, of course, we all completely agreed on the first group because we all gave it a 4, but we remarkably agreed on all the remaining groups also, that our scores were virtually identical, even though we didn't look at each other's scores as we made them. Because if you start with that same frame of reference, now we know what's better, what's worse, and we can give scores that are higher or lower with really good confidence. So we do get greater appraisal accuracy when we all agree on what does exactly a 4 mean. Like, let's all look at the same behavior and let's give that a 4. And then we're going to look at other behaviors, and it's either better or worse than what we saw before. So with this kind of training, we can make supervisors and managers and things a lot more accurate in their ratings, and I would like to argue, a lot more confident in their ratings, because like I said previously, nobody really wants to be doing this appraisal process. And so, sometimes we get overly lenient scores because I don't want my employees to be mad at me, things like that. If I can feel confident that I've made a decent score and that my score isn't based on me liking or not liking somebody, or being grumpy today, or if I can feel confident that my score is legitimate, I'm going to feel a lot better about the scores I'm giving. So this kind of training can be really empowering. Okay, rater goals and accountability. Okay, each individual rater may have different goals from each other independent rater, right? When we are doing it, let's say a 360-degree rating, the goals of the customers are probably different from the goals of the coworkers, which are probably different from the goals of the direct supervisor and the management, right? Like, every rater probably has its slightly different goal in mind. So as a result, we may not all be looking for the same things, but as long as we are holding raters accountable for their accuracy, and we're holding them accountable for being too lenient in their ratings, we will get pretty good consistent scores across these raters. So even though the customer might be concerned about whether, the employee's behavior led to the consumer getting what they wanted, like objectively from this interaction, and the supervisor's goal might be to ensure that the employee has been consistent and conscientious. Like, those are kind of different goals. As long as the raters are held accountable for accuracy and held accountable for being overly lenient, we can end up with very consistent scores. We have a little bit less control over somebody like a customer, but we have a lot of control over the peers of the worker, the supervisors, the management. We have a lot of control over those ratings. And what we want to see is like consistency, so we can look for themes and start to figure out what's really going on with this employee. Raters who are high in conscientiousness are more affected by accountability pressures than people who are lower in conscientiousness are. And so holding people accountable really only works for certain raters, ones who care whether they've been held accountable or not, right? Who are feeling conscientious about doing a good job. They're the ones who will benefit the most from feeling pressured to be, that your rating matters. Have you turned your rating in? Make sure that your rating is based on things that you've seen across the whole year. Like, all those pieces of information are going to have a bigger impact on somebody who's higher in conscientiousness than somebody who's lower in that same trait. All right, so let's talk about that contemporary performance appraisal research that I promised you at the beginning of this segment. So there are different categories of research in this area. So the first category I wanted to talk about is the importance of social psychological context. So early researchers were really focusing in on trying to develop rating formats, like literally that Likert type scale that we talked about before, or the bars scale, things like that. They were really interested in developing the checklists or like that. They were really interested in actually developing the formats. And then they were really interested in trying to quantify what the rater errors were, like really define those errors and trying to figure out ways to work around those errors. Like, that's where early research was really focused on, was the tools, right? The rating formats, and then the implementation of those tools. whether the raters were making errors in judgment and things like that. Contemporary issues really emphasize the social psychological process and the context. So what we mean by context is, all the stuff that puts pressure on raters, all the stuff that puts pressure on employees. That's what we're talking about. So the social context, in different eras, the social context varies with regard to the pressure on employees to perform well because they may not be able to replace this job. If something happened, if they got fired because of poor performance or something, it would be difficult for them to find another job. Whereas in other times of our history, there's been a lot of extra jobs and not a lot of employees to fill it. And so if things aren't working out for me at this position, that's fine. There are probably 3 other places I could get a job, right? So you can imagine the attitude of a rate E who knows that they could just walk out of here and get another job versus one who feels like, I may not find another job if something happens with this one. So those kinds of social contexts, which also kind of ties to political contexts and emotional climates, right? All of those things are sort of tied together. Legal contexts, our culture has been becoming more and more litigious over time. And so companies really have to be concerned about making sure that their ratings and their rating procedures are completely fair and unbiased. We want to try and eliminate as many of those errors that raters can make so that it later couldn't come back and be something that would be the source of a lawsuit. So there are a lot of those little sort of intangibles / things that might change a lot depending on what's going on in the culture at the time that can really have impacts on, how rating is done, how rating is received, things like that. Now I want to talk for a second about something called reaction criteria. The role of the rater and the ratee reactions in the performance appraisal process is what we're talking about with reaction criteria. And satisfaction on the part of the rater and satisfaction on the part of the ratee are affected by performance appraisal characteristics and organizational variables. So we talked a little bit about how certain kinds of appraisals can lead to greater satisfaction by the ratee, right? Like if the appraisal is clear and you've presented enough information to convey what the appraisal is basically telling the employee, but not so much that it overwhelms them, right? So like there are certain things about an appraisal that will make it more likely that the employee will feel good about it at the end, right? And then I also mentioned that there are certain characteristics of the tool that can affect how satisfied the rater is, right? Like I mentioned that a lot of raters don't like checklists because it can't really expand on what they want to say. It feels very like you're checking off boxes rather than doing a meaningful rate. And so there are characteristics like that that can have an impact on the satisfaction of the person doing the rating and the person being rated. And then there are organizational variables that can have an impact on how the rater and the ratee react to the performance appraisal process. If the organization's putting a lot of pressure on the raters, it may have an impact on how satisfied the rater feels with their own role in the appraisal process. If they feel like they're just a cog and they don't really get to rate their own employees the way that they want to, you can imagine that would cause frustration in a supervisor who feels like they don't get to be authentic. They don't get to do things the way that they want to. They are having to do what the organization has determined. I just read an interesting article about correctional employees and how they feel like there are orders that come down from the organizational hierarchy, and it's just up to the frontline employees to just do it. They have no choice. There's no wiggle room, and that makes for a lot of dissatisfaction in employees when they feel like they just have to do whatever has been given to them by the people above them, and that includes the rating process. So if the rater feels like they are part of the organizational structure, their voice gets heard, things like that, they're going to feel a lot better about the process. And then the rate E, the person who's being rated will feel better about the rating if they feel like the organization has made them feel valued, if they've really conveyed that message that we want you to develop and be part of this team, those kinds of messages. So subordinates are less angry and they have higher perceptions of justice when the rater justified the ratings. So it's less likely that an employee will be upset if the rater says, these are the reasons why I gave you the scores I gave you. So we're back to that why raters are unhappy with the checklists, because there's really no mechanism in checklists for a clear, this is why I gave you this is why I gave you that. Being able to explain, for example, if you're a new employee and this is your first rating, this is your first performance appraisal, to have your supervisor say, I gave you all 4s because that's what we give to people on their first ratings. And now we'll see if you go up or you go down relative to those 4s, right? And we'll see that in your next performance appraisal. So don't take it like that was bad. You're performing exactly like we would expect a new employee to do. And now this is your baseline. And we're going to be comparing you to this. That makes a subordinate feel a lot better than if they are just handed a sheet and it has all 4s on them out of 7s. They are going to possibly feel bad. If it's made clear to them that their ratings are different from, let's say, their peers' ratings, in part because their peer's been there longer, or because their peer did some stuff that the employee didn't know their peer had done, then that helped to bring up their scores. If things are justified and made sense, employees tend to be less angry and they tend to see it as more just. It's more likely that performance appraisals will be viewed as unfair when they contribute to ratees' emotional exhaustion. When we have performance appraisals that don't align with how we think we've been doing, oftentimes we generally as employees think, I've been doing my best. I really have been caring about this job, but they don't seem to care about me. And it can contribute to employees saying, I've had enough. It's just not worth it anymore. And if we've got an employee in our organization that we really value and we want them to stay, we don't want to accidentally give them that message, right? That nothing they do matters and that they're going to get these poor performance appraisals no matter how hard they try. So we don't want to contribute to ratees' emotional exhaustion. We want them to be able to view the performance appraisals as fair, like they've earned it, and that their scores relative to their peers make sense and things like that. All right, so the supervisor-subordinate relationship is obviously coming into focus as we're talking about performance appraisal, right? Because almost always you're going to have at least part of your appraisal coming from a supervisor to a subordinate. So with the leader-member exchange theory, the employee-supervisor relationship affects the performance appraisal process in the frequency of communication. If you have an employee-supervisor relationship where there's a lot of communication going on, it tends to be the case that performance appraisals are higher as a result of the frequent communication. A lot of times, I remember when I worked for retail and the district manager would come through and we'd help be like, oh no, the district manager's coming, clean up the place. We'd all start freaking out because we're going to be seen by the district manager. Actually, research suggests if that district manager is going to have any role in our performance appraisal, we would benefit from seeing that district manager more often, right? And having communication with that district manager more often, because a lot of times what happens with more communication is that there are a couple of stages of what I want to say. There's on the one hand, there's the opportunity for the supervisor and the subordinate to get more and more in alignment with how protocols will be followed and when a decision has to be made, what information needs to be weighed and things like that to make a good decision. So the more opportunity to communicate, the more likely the subordinate is to actually make the kinds of decisions and engage in the kinds of behaviors that the supervisor really wants to see, because they've had that opportunity to really convey those values really to the subordinate across all this communication. So communication is a really important factor in conveying organizational culture and expectations and all sorts of things that will help in the long run for the subordinate to rate well in their performance appraisal. So the more communication, typically the better ratings, which is really super relevant as we've gone to, spring quarter 2020 being all online. Whether you wanted it or not, you might be feeling like, well, I'm not having this opportunity to have communication with my teacher in a way that would allow me to really understand what's going on. And unfortunately, with online learning, and anybody who's taking this class as an online class in general anyway knows, a lot of reading involved in the communication between teacher and student in this context. A lot of times it's true in any structure, though, that a lot of the communication between supervisor and subordinate might be in writing. So these are actually good practices for future employees to get into, to be used to reading their emails thoroughly, reading the company handbook. In the case of a class, it would be the syllabus. When there's a task to be performed, read all the instructions for the task, whether it's for class or it's for work. I mean, a lot of these tasks, a lot of the situations directly mirror from university or college work to the workplace. A lot of the exact same behaviors are needed. And so when considering communication, it's not always got to be face-to-face. It could be really well-written emails. It could be, some of you might have used something called Voxer, which is a kind of instant message kind of thing, but you record your voice and then you send that recording to your colleague and they can listen to what you said and then they can respond with their voice. So things don't have to be all typed. And so it's a little bit quicker, but it's not face to face. Now, yeah, you can hear email, you can hear, you can hear emotion, you can hear voices, you can, that's kind of an improvement. But be prepared that it isn't always going to be how often we get to sit down face to face and discuss something. It could be just how frequently we touch bases with each other, how often, we're checking in. How about organizational politics? Always a fun thing to figure out what the politics of the organization is. So deliberate attempts by individuals to enhance or protect their self-interests when conflicting courses of action are possible is what we mean by organizational politics. We got that from Longenecker, Sims, and Gioia. 1987 was the original definition of it. So organizational politics, the key thing here is that if there are multiple routes to a solution, when we have our own self-interest being held above the organization's self-interest, that's when we're getting into organizational politics. So at the executive level, we find that executives manipulate performance appraisal to make the department look good. Perhaps they might manipulate performance appraisal to send a message to their subordinate that they might be in trouble or that, they need to really crack down on their underlings, right? So executives can use performance appraisal to send messages to their managers below them or to their frontline employees. Subordinates can engage in what we call impression management, where they try and control their behavior to make a good impression. When I first read this when I was a student, that it reminded me so much of when I was in third grade, and I remember that the principal came into our classroom. And I remember literally thinking as a little third grade, this is going to sound stupid, but I remember that, oh no, the principal's here. And we were all coloring at the time. And so I decided I was going to really, really, really make sure I did not go out of the lines while the principal was there. I was like so busy trying to, manage the impression I was giving to the principal because look how good my coloring is. Super funny if you think about it. But blow it up to adulthood. And what do we do at work, right? Why did we all run around and try and clean up the store if the district manager was coming? We were trying to, give a good impression. Look, we always tidy up before we go home. Seriously, we do. You want to make sure that you're giving a good impression to the supervisors. And so sometimes you'll have employees who don't behave that well when the supervisor's gone, and then suddenly they do when they're there. Or you'll have employees who know that their performance evaluation is coming up. So suddenly, they're trying for that recency effect where they're trying to make sure that they're always on time to work and don't make any mistakes while they're at work and stuff like that, hoping that that's the last thing that their supervisor will remember right before the evaluation and things like that. We're trying to manage the impression. And so controlling our behavior. Trust and justice, kind of ironic right after the organizational politics, right? Because why do we have trust issues at work? Well, part of it is because we're never sure. Are we being encouraged to engage in behaviors that are beneficial to the organization altogether, or are we being encouraged to engage in behaviors that would be beneficial to the person who has encouraged us to engage in these behaviors, right? It's hard to trust when you're at work. It's more likely that you'll trust when you see a lot of justice going on in the workplace. So trust is the extent to which the raters believe that a fair and accurate appraisal has been made in their organization. So can we trust that the performance appraisal process will be fair and accurate is basically the issue there. When the raters have less trust, they tend to be more lenient in their scoring. And this was revealed through a survey that was developed that's called Trust in the Appraisal Process. So there's a survey about appraisal processing. That's kind of an interesting little irony, right? Because a performance appraisal oftentimes looks a lot like a survey. So the results of this Trust in the Appraisal Process survey found that those raters who scored lower on trust were more lenient in their ratings. So think about why that might be the case, right? If I don't trust that fair and accurate appraisal has been made in the organization and I'm supposed to be making ratings, I might think, well, if everybody else is padding their group's ratings, right? Like, let's say I'm the supervisor of one group and there are supervisors of other groups that are sort of on the same level in the organization. If I think that all my peers who are rating their underlings have been padding the scores and boosting the scores, I'm going to be, if I'm feeling that untrusting about my peers, I'm going to be more lenient in my scoring because I don't want my employees to look bad compared to my peers. So lower scorers tend to be more lenient. People who have higher trust in their organization tend to give more realistic ratings. Now, the performance appraisal discomfort scale was another scale that was administered, and they found that high scorers were the most lenient on this one. So people who had the most discomfort about the performance appraisal process were the most lenient. So if I don't trust my employer, and if I am very uncomfortable in this process, I'm going to tend to be more lenient. Can you imagine if I have both of these problems, right? I don't really trust the organization, and I feel very uncomfortable being put in a position of having to judge my peers, even if they are my employees, right? You can imagine that I'm going to be a lot more lenient in my scoring. Now, I know that there are a lot of people who just fundamentally have difficulty rating other people. They just really do. Whether they trust their organization in general or not, they just have this overall discomfort about this performance appraisal and being put in a position of applying numbers to other people and things like that. So some people just have a lot of trouble with that. So these are independent, they are sort of isolated concepts. You could see how if you had both in play, low on the trust in the appraisal process and high on the performance appraisal discomfort, boy, you really would have difficulty giving, accurate ratings. The good news is that at least with regard to the performance appraisal discomfort scale, we can train raters to become more comfortable. One of the things that can really help raters is to realize it's completely fine to start with those mid-range scores and then move from there. As you've come into this scenario and you're new to this group, let's say, Maybe you just got promoted to a supervisor or something and you're thinking, who am I to be judging these people I used to just work with? It's completely, to train that new person that it's completely fine to start off with mid-range scores, explain to your employees, since I'm new in this position, we're going to start off with these ratings and then we'll work from here, right? Like make them feel more comfortable by empowering them that they don't have to be, giving 2s and 6s and like that. It's okay to be giving 4s and then move from there. It makes people a lot more confident. And then next time they go through the appraisal process, they'll feel a lot less discomfort. All right, continuing on with trust and justice. Justice is if raters or ratees see the appraisal process as unfair or biased, its psychometric quality will be irrelevant. So psychometric is really sort of statistical testing quality. So basically what we're saying here is that if either the raters or the ratees see the appraisal process as unfair or as biased, that we won't really know what to make of the numbers that come from the ratings. They just won't even make sense necessarily. We can't trust them. So if you believe that people can change, then we tend to, we call that like a growth mindset. You have one perspective on the world. The other perspective under implicit person theory, the other perspective would be that you are how you are, that you have certain traits or abilities, and some people have more of this trait or less of it, more of this ability or less of it, and you just sort of, that's how people are. And that's called a fixed mindset. Supervisors who believe that people can change are perceived as more just in their appraisals. So those supervisors who convey the message that, well, with some hard work and some effort, I know that you're going to be able to pick up these skills. Supervisors who give that kind of message are viewed as more just than supervisors who say, well, I know that, this isn't really your thing. I know that this isn't your natural tendency, right? Those kinds of terms imply this fixed mindset, and ratees who get that kind of feedback oftentimes see the rater as unjust, right? As being, sort of pigeonholing them as having certain skills or not having certain skills. So people seem to vary on whether they think, that people can change or not. But here's the great news. Whether you think it or not think it, you can still give messages about the idea that people can improve and change with diligence and effort. So even if you take a person who really has that fixed mindset, they can still express the kinds of sentiments that would allow a ratee to feel good about an appraisal. So again, this can be offset with training. It's not that, because it would be very fixed mindset of us to say, you either think people have the ability to grow and change or you don't think that, right? So that's clearly, if we think people can change, we think that part of people can change also. So we can absolutely train supervisors to take an approach that will be perceived as much more just by the people that they're rating. All right. So, normally I do this in class. You can get out a piece of paper and a pencil if you wish and play along on a little implicit person test. So, even though I just said test, it's not a test. It's an opinion survey about beliefs and goals regarding ability and performance. And it's very important that you give your honest opinion, not what you believe someone else would think best. It's almost better that, we're doing this not in the classroom, because you can write down whatever you want to write down, right? So for each statement, you're going to decide how much you agree or disagree with the statement and write down your answer. So your choices are going to run from 1 to 6, nice Likert type scale. And 1 is going to represent disagree a lot, and 6 represents agree a lot. You'll notice that there's no middle ground. You either disagree at least a little, or you agree at least a little, right? So we're kind of, this scale was designed so that you don't get to have that middle of the road kind of neutral. I didn't design the scale. All right. Number 1, no matter how much intelligence you have, you can always change it a good deal. So you can go ahead and rate how much you agree with. No matter how much intelligence you have, you can always change it a good deal. 2, you can learn new things, but you cannot really change your basic level of intelligence. 3, I like my work best when it makes me think hard. 4, I like my work best when I can do it really well without too much trouble. 5, I like work that I'll learn from even if I make a lot of mistakes. 6, I like my work best when I can do it perfectly without any mistakes. 7, when something is hard, it just makes me want to work more on it, not less. 8, to tell the truth, when I work hard, it makes me feel as though I'm not very smart. All right, so you got your 8 items. If you need to go back or anything, you're welcome to do that. So to compute your score, you're going to add up your ratings for the odd questions, 1, 3, 5, and 7. Then for the even questions, you're going to reverse your ratings. So that means that if you gave it a 1 initially, you're going to switch it to a 6, and you're going to legitimately change the score. So if you gave it a 1, your answer is now 6. If you gave it a 2, your answer is now 5. 3 becomes a 4, and so on down this little rubric. So reverse your ratings for those 4. And then add up the new ratings for those 4 items. Add it up with the odd questions, and that's going to give you your growth mindset profile. So there were 8 items, so your score can range from 8 to 48. So make sure that your total is somewhere in between 8 and 48. That'll help you with any kind of math errors you might have. And then here's how you interpret your score. So we've got your number profile ranging from 8 to 48, and they've broken it down into little segments. So your mindset assessment profile, if you're in the 8 to 16 range, you believe strongly that your intelligence is fixed. It doesn't change much. If you can't perform perfectly, you'd rather not do something. You think smart people don't have to work hard. The next group, 17 to 24, you lean toward thinking that your intelligence doesn't change much. You prefer not to make mistakes if you can help it, and you also really don't like to put in a lot of work. You may think that learning should be easy. 25 to 32, you are unsure whether you can change your intelligence. You care about your performance and also want to learn, but you don't really want to have to work too hard for it. 33 to 40, you believe that your intelligence is something that you can increase. You care about learning and you're willing to work hard. You do want to do well, but you think it's more important to learn than to always perform well. And then 41 to 48, you really feel sure that you can increase your intelligence by learning and you like a challenge. You believe the best way to learn is to work hard and you don't mind making mistakes while you do it. Okay, so a little example of a growth mindset test, only 8 items and pretty elaborate descriptions of what you must think based on what score you got. I'm a little bit skeptical that those 8 items would really distinguish that much, especially since I just explained to you what growth mindset is right before we took the test. So don't infer too much from your scores. I just thought it would be kind of fun to sort of see some of the example items where they would be looking at growth mindset tendencies and, tying that back to, performance appraisal and the kind of feedback that we might be giving to employees based on whether we think that they can grow or we think that they are fixed. All right. That seems like a long enough segment. Let's come back and talk about participation in the next segment.